Hello again, everyone. My name is Andrew Easler. I'm an instructor for drugtestingcourses.com. Today I wanted to talk to you about whether or not you need an MRO involved in the process for any type of drug or alcohol test. Now there's a couple of different answers, sometimes yes and sometimes no. So when it comes to an alcohol test, whether it's federally regulated, it really will only depend if you have somebody who might have a lung condition or a condition that would diminish their capacity or their ability to breathe. And that would obviously affect their ability to provide a sufficient sample of that deep lung air that we need for any type of breath alcohol test that we're conducting. Now, alternatively, some federal agencies require a blood test or allow a blood test like the Federal Railway Administration, and that would obviously never be an issue with the breath situation. So you wouldn't need an MRO to help us out with determining whether or not there is a medical condition that would diminish somebody's breath alcohol in that instance. But really, that's going to be the extent of an MRO's involvement for an alcohol test when it comes to any type of federally regulated program. Now, some states don't even allow, if you're under state regulations, do not even allow an alcohol test, like Maryland. They don't allow breath alcohol tests for anything other than federally regulated employees, or what we call covered employees. Now, when it comes to drug testing specifically, this can also be a little bit tricky. So when it comes to federally regulated drug testing programs, you're looking at Department of Health and Human Services and the United States Department of Transportation and all of those subcategories underneath the Department of Transportation. It is absolutely required that you have an MRO involved in the process. There's no ifs, ands, or buts when it comes to that. So that makes things a little bit easy for setting up those accounts and getting those, everything set up with that process. Now, when it comes to state-specific laws, when it comes to drug testing and whether an MRO is required, that's where it gets a little bit dicey. Okay, so some states like Texas do not require the use of an MRO at all. So they don't say anything about it. They don't mention an MRO. If you want to use it, you can use it. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to. Okay. Other states absolutely require the use of MRO. You can't do a test without involving an MRO. And then some states are kind of in between. So if you have like a voluntary state drug testing law, and you voluntarily opt into their specific protocols for drug and alcohol testing, then you have to follow their protocols, and their protocols may require that you use an MRO. So you're going to have to look at your local state laws and also your local state common law for any of the case precedent, for example, like in California, that really affect how we view and how we operate our drug and alcohol testing policies, and whether or not we need to use that MRO. So legally, it goes a little bit dicey. There's a lot of questions to ask whether you have to use an MRO or not. Now, let's say you're in a situation where all right, so I've checked the laws, I'm in Texas, I haven't opted in for any voluntary, drug testing laws. I don't need that MRO. Why should I use them anyway? Why would I pay that extra expense to have somebody review the results? I can just have my nurse on site review them and then don't have to worry about paying somebody. Let's talk about why that might be highly encouraged to use the MRO rather than not use them. So let's say we have an employee. We'll call him Alfred. Alfred comes to us for let's say he was in a post-accident. Okay, he was driving in a forklift. He hit a whole bunch of racks in the warehouse, and we believe maybe alcohol or drugs could have been a factor. Okay, we run our test on him. The lab comes back and says, you know what, we have a positive concentration here for amphetamines. Okay, so we take that result, and now the employer will, if without an MRO, will take that result, look at it, and say, okay, so this guy's got, he's got positive for amphetamines. Let's see if there's a medical explanation for why he has amphetamines in his system. So we'll have the nurse on site call Alfred and say, hey, Alfred, I see that you have a concentration of amphetamines in your system. Is that surprising to you? And Alfred's going to say, no, I've got a prescription for it, so that's why it shows up in the system. So the nurse on site says, okay, great, send me your prescription. I'll verify it with the pharmacy and then get back to you. So she gets that information. She calls around. Pharmacist says, yeah, sure, definitely has that prescription. She calls a physician who prescribed it. He says, yep, we definitely prescribed it for Alfred. She says, okay, great, we can write off that panel. Back to work, Alfred. Okay, we're not going to attribute any positive results to you. He goes back to work, and then all of a sudden he has another accident. Okay, this time he toppled over the racks and he ended up killing somebody. Okay, so now we've got a major problem. We do another post-accident drug test, same result. He still shows positive for amphetamines. Okay, now we go forward. We know that he has that prescription. We re-verify it, let's say, and we have no issues. Everything checks out. The problem is now we have the spouse of the person who got injured at work and ended up dying. Okay, they find out that through the grapevine that Alfred had a prescription for amphetamines and he tested positive on his drug test, but they let him go back to work. So she gets a subpoena and pulls up the records and is able to get those medical records to determine what those results ended up being. She finds out that the concentration on that lab report was 20 times the amount that would really be consistent with his dosage that he was prescribed, that we had somehow just written off because he had a prescription. So he was actually, what he was doing, he was supplementing that amphetamine with a recreational amphetamine, and he was way over impaired at work, and that's possible as to what basically contributed to the accident. Now we have a company who has basically given a stamp of approval for this guy Alfred to go back to work while he was under the influence and had a problem. So this is why we don't want to use just somebody on site, like a nurse or somebody who's not specially trained on how to review the results. Okay, that's just one example. It may sound extreme, but it does happen. Right? So in those states that don't require it, we do see a lot of these cases occurring. So when it comes to doing these, it's well worth the money to pay for an MRO to just review those results, independently verify that, and then let them take on that liability, right? Because if you get that stamp of approval from the MRO, that's your company mitigating that risk because you've paid for somebody who really knows their stuff. They're that specially trained MD or DO who knows what they're doing. They know how to review those results and determine whether it's consistent with that prescription and whether that person could go back to work and safely operate that forklift, rather than just having somebody on site who's maybe got a little bit of medical knowledge but is not that expert in referring that information. So hopefully that answered a lot of your questions on MROs, their role in the process, and whether you actually have to utilize one in your procedure. Thank you.